Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the integration of the Divine Feminine in the individual and society as a whole. Now this video is actually the third video in a series. So the past two videos that I did, they are about systems thinking and about yin and yang. So it can be of benefit if you want to go watch those first, but if you don't want to watch those first and you want to watch this one first, it should be fine too. They all kind of work together, so it's not like you would have to watch particular ones first to get the benefit of them. And I'm going to basically summarize those things in just a moment, and you'll get the basic idea, and then if you wanted to watch those other videos later just for enrichment on the topic, you could. Now this video is about the integration of the Divine Feminine. So if you look at the integration of the Divine Feminine, systems thinking, and yin and yang, you might not immediately see how these topics are connected. But ultimately, what I'm doing with these videos that I'll be coming out with in the future and the ones that I just came out with is basically trying to tie together a bunch of loosely related topics in hopes of creating a more complete picture of what's going on with you as an individual and with society as a whole, so that we can kind of progress and move forward and sort of remove all the barriers we have toward expansion of consciousness. So in this video, I'm going to be telling you all about how to aid in the integration of the Divine Feminine, and also pointing out many of the barriers that we have toward doing so, again, on the individual and on the societal levels. And so hopefully in doing so, you can start to see how yin and yang and systems thinking really go hand in hand. And so this video will kind of give you more of an idea of how those things really relate together. And in seeing this connection, you can see how many of the issues that we're facing as individuals and as a whole species are basically the symptoms that stem off of this imbalance, because this imbalance and disintegration of the Divine Feminine is what causes so many of the issues in our societies and in our own psyches too. Now, recognizing the disintegration of the Divine Feminine will help us notice imbalances that we may not have noticed before, and areas that we have repressions that we may not have realized before, or we can even see on, the societal level, there are certain ideas that are resisted against heavily, and we can start to understand why that is and what the effects of that are. And so I would admonish you, don't be scared away by the idea of the Divine Feminine if you're not a woman, because this is not specifically for women. The Divine Feminine is something that's in all of us, and it's something that affects everyone. And so this issue of Divine Feminine repression is something that affects every single person alive on the planet today. So definitely watch the whole video, because this is a very, very important topic. In fact, this is the second time I've recorded this topic. Normally I record it much sooner. I'm doing this kind of last minute. That's why I'm posting so late, because I just think that this topic really needs to have justice done by it. And it'll probably be one of my longer videos when all is said and done. All right, so real quick, I want to give you kind of a refresher about systems thinking, and also about yin and yang, or especially if you haven't watched those videos, just so that you get an idea of how those two things work together, and also how they kind of relate back to Divine Feminine integration. All right, so basically, if we look at systems thinking, it's the basic idea behind systems thinking is that a system is essentially a bunch of parts that work together as an interconnected network or a whole that produces particular behaviors. So a system basically is comprised of parts, relationships between those parts, and a particular function or behavior. Now, in our universe, systems are all over the place. In fact, most everything is part of a system. There's nothing that isn't part of a system. And in fact, we have systems within systems within systems. So the galaxy at large, that's a system. Our solar system is also a system. Our planet is a system. Our body is a system. And in fact, our body is a system that's made up of other systems. Atoms are systems, so basically anything that has parts that work together to create a behavior of some kind is a system. So if we familiarize ourselves with the way systems work and we can start to notice the common patterns of how systems work, we can start to notice the order within the chaos. Now, systems tend to be very complex on the surface level of things, but ultimately at their bedrock level, at the deepest level, they are really the result of a combination between yin energy and yang energy. In fact, if a system lacks yin or yang, it isn't a system at all. It requires both in conjunction, and yin and yang truly can never be separate. So basically what yin and yang are is the binary code that create every living and non-living system. So as such, they're kind of the ones and zeros that give life to the entire reality. Now, thinking of yin and yang as code is a very, very important metaphor. So if ever you've played a video game, you should understand that the video game was created by somebody who understood how to code. And so, like, let's say if you're playing a game like Mario or any other platform game, or really any game, you're playing it, the reason why you're able to interact with it and play it is because it's coded, even if you can't see the code outright. So the reason why Mario can jump when you press the B button is because somebody coded it that way. Or the reason why if Mario jumps on a platform and doesn't fall right through the platform, it's because there's a very specific piece of code for that that's been applied to the game. So as a game player, it's not really important for you to see the code or to understand the code to play the game. In fact, that's like something that probably never crosses the average person's mind. Oh, how is this coded? But it's still an integral part of playing it, because otherwise it would just be a picture. It wouldn't be interactive at all. On the other hand, if someone is familiar with the code that the game is written in and they know how to code, essentially their experience of playing the game is just going to be a little bit different. So they're going to play the game the exact same way, but they're going to have an awareness of how the game works. And if there are glitches in the game, they're going to know what mistake happened that caused those glitches. So basically, without seeing the code directly, they can see how the expression of the code is coming across within the gameplay. So if we take this analogy to video game code, and you look at the code, which is really, for somebody who doesn't understand code at all, it's just a bunch of random symbols, and so it doesn't really have a lot of expression on its own. It doesn't really mean anything. And then you take the video game and how it's played, if you're not aware of how those two things connect, then, you might not be able to make the connection at all. So you see the code, and then you essentially see the expression of the code in the form of how the video game works. And essentially, that's sort of the way that yin and yang works. So yin and yang are subtle energies, and they're so subtle that the average person can't really pick up on them in their raw form. It is possible to pick up on them in their raw form, if you happen to be very, very, very receptive, but you would have to have such a subtlety of awareness that really, you'd have to probably train yourself for years to do so. Like even now, I currently can't pick up on it. The only time that I was able to was when I had transcended the ego. But ultimately, what you can do is you can tell where those energies tend to express. So there's a big difference between the code itself in the form of yin and yang, which is very subtle and has very little expression, and the expression of that code into reality. And the thing with those expressions of that code into reality is that they happen to work in particular ways that are very predictable. So you start to notice patterns in things, and you can pretty accurately tell when something is more yin than yang, and you can pretty accurately tell when something is more yang than yin. So if we can look at reality through the perspective of a game coder, systems thinking becomes a lot easier to do, and we can start to notice common patterns and common issues that come up as a result of those patterns. So as I said before, systems are usually very messy and complex. They're like ordered chaos. But ultimately, at the deepest level, they're a very simple combination of yin and yang in varying ways. And so if we can start to recognize that yin and yang tend to express themselves in common ways, we can start to notice patterns within systems more easily, and we can start to really get a better idea of how the system works as a whole. And essentially, it's this divine code of yin and yang that creates the order within the chaos. So how does this topic relate to the disintegration of the divine feminine? Well, essentially what the divine feminine is the feminine aspect of God. And essentially that aspect of God that writes the yin aspect of the code. And so if we as a society have a resistance to yin expressions, we have a resistance to the divine feminine, which sort of insulates ourselves from the experience of having connection with the divine feminine. So when the divine feminine writes the code of yin, yin again is a subtle energy, doesn't have much expression on its own, but it tends to reflect itself in many expressions. And so the expressions that are most common reflections of yin, these are aspects of what is referred to as the feminine principle. Now in a moment I'm going to be talking about the feminine principle and the masculine principle and some common expressions within those two principles. So basically I'm talking about the most common expressions of yin and the most common expressions of yang. And ultimately that'll help you see how society has more of a yang slant. So we tend to like more ideas within the masculine principle as a society and actually as a human species at this point than we do the feminine principle. And this creates many different issues that stem off of this imbalance and this repression of the feminine. So essentially what we can do is we can look at our personal attitudes and we can look at common cultural beliefs and attitudes relative to the feminine principle. And we can kind of see where our imbalances lie. And so in doing so, we should realize that if we as individuals have a resistance to particular traits, let's say within the feminine principle, you know, and that basically restricts the free flowing of yin and yang within us. Essentially, it allows less of us to come to the table and it insulates us from the divine feminine. Now, the same thing would be the case with yang energy, you know, and an individual person can certainly have an issue with the integration of yang energy as well. And that's why I'm mentioning even the yang traits in this video. But ultimately, on the societal level, we can notice that society either has an indifferent or even an outright hostile sort of feeling toward many of the traits within the feminine principle, or we just have a lack of awareness. So there's a lot of like untapped potential there as well, because our ideas of the feminine culturally are very, very narrow. And it's this constriction of the free flow between yin and yang and the repression of yin that creates our system to work in suboptimal ways. And basically, whenever you have resistance to yin, you're also resisting the feminine aspect of God, the divine feminine. And likewise with yang, if you have a resistance to yang, you're resisting the masculine aspect of God or the divine masculine. And this ultimately makes us less conscious as an individual, but if these same patterns are affecting society as a whole, the entire society will be less conscious as well. Alright, so I'm about to give you some common examples of how yin energy tends to express itself and how yang energy tends to express itself, really what the things are that comprise the feminine and masculine principle. But I want to give a few caveats before I do that. So the first one is to understand that the feminine principle and the masculine principle, again, aren't meant to be like women's traits and men's traits. Really, ultimately, any trait that's humanly embodiable in those two lists, you know, really belong to all human beings in varying degrees. So it's important to not like look at one list or the other list and say, oh, well, I'm a man, I want to do all these things in the masculine principle. Or, oh, I'm a woman, I want to do all the things within the feminine principle. You know, that's not really a good way to use that. Ultimately, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to use this as sort of a roadmap to being able to discover where your resistances are, so that you are removing barriers to that resistance. You know, the idea is not to try to contrive something of yourself. You know, don't try to put masculinity on and don't try to put femininity on. Ultimately, what you're trying to do is you're trying to essentially remove all the barriers to realizing what's actually there. Now, that said, there is an implicit tie between yin energy and the divine feminine and women as a whole group generally speaking. And then, you know, the same thing with yang energy. So there's an implicit tie between manhood, the ideas of manhood, men as a whole group, yang energy, and the divine masculine. So all of those things relate, but each individual is really a combination of both yin and yang, and so they have both traits from the masculine and feminine principle. But mostly remember that these traits totally supersede gender. So again, gender is not, these things aren't expressions of gender. Gender is an expression of these things. So, you know, don't mix it up. And also, when it comes to ideas of traditional femininity and traditional masculinity, and especially traditional femininity though, what we have is a very stripped down version of these principles. You know, essentially because we weren't able to express in particular ways in particular societies, and because we've lived in patriarchal societies that were polarly patriarchal up until about 100 years ago, you know, essentially what came of the feminine principle is that honestly femininity got stripped down to really just a few of the most indispensable traits of it, and all of the rest got relegated down to the collective shadow. And so essentially what we have with the divine feminine particularly is we have like the iceberg effect. So we're only really conscious of the tip of the iceberg of the feminine principle. And if I say, oh, you know, that person's really feminine, you know, you might think of that as synonymous with, oh, that person is a woman who is very beautiful. You know, so we have a very narrow definition of it. But essentially, what we're dealing with is the tip of the iceberg effect. We only know really of a few traits within the feminine principle currently, and all the rest is really underneath the surface of consciousness. And so really what our goal is to be able to basically remove the barriers to that iceberg being able to float more up to the surface of the water so that we can realize more of the feminine principle. Now there's plenty to still be realized within the masculine principle as well. There's still a ton underneath the surface of the water, you know, but we don't have as much of a resistance to that. So there are fewer barriers to the integration of the masculine principle. That said, like I said, there's plenty of untapped potential there. So if you personally feel like you have a lot of untapped yang potentials, or, you know, a lot of yang repression, then I highly recommend, you know, trying to do some shadow work on that too, and removing the barriers to that coming up and being realized and exalted to its highest form. You know, but by and large, on the societal level, the much bigger issue is that repression of the feminine. Now, having said that about the tip of the iceberg with the feminine principle, you know, the traits that are usually ascribed to femininity, even those like top ones, there's still an aspect of the feminine principle. So it's not me saying like, oh, you know, don't think of the divine feminine as an expression of beauty, because beauty is an aspect of the feminine principle. You know, or, you know, something like motherhood, which is a very traditional kind of way to look at femininity. So motherhood is also part and parcel to the feminine principle. So just because it's been traditionally the case that these have been associated with the feminine doesn't mean that they're not an aspect of the feminine principle. Usually what traditional, you know, norms have done have just kind of like seen femininity as a threat to the social order of the time and basically just made it go like under the surface. So that's why that has come about, and I'm going to go into that a little bit later toward the end of the video, why things have become that way, why it's been repressed for so many thousands of years. You know, so before I go into all these traits, you know, my advice is just, you know, don't resist what's naturally there within you. Accept it, whether it's in the feminine principle or the masculine principle, no matter what gender you are, how you identify. You know, and ultimately don't over-identify with one or the other. You know, don't like look at stuff within, you know, the principle that corresponds most with your gender and think, oh, well, I'm so awesome, you know, and try to like contrive more of that within your personality. You know, don't try to polarize yourself. Just notice exactly what's there and accept whatever's there. You know, because like I said, we're all sort of androgynous in a way. We have traits from the feminine and the masculine principle. I'm going to go over some of the traits within the feminine principle. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but here are some of the most common ways they express themselves. Introspection, integration, species connectivity, vulnerability, wonderment, sensitivity, subtlety of awareness, holistic thinking, contraction, non-linearity, presence, wisdom, receptivity and allowing, awareness of cycles, birth and death, compassion and caretaking, care for the earth and its creatures, stillness and meditation, being, the mystical and the magical, reality or existence, intuition, darkness and mystery, connection to nature, surrender to reality's flow, emotional awareness, psychology, the subconscious, connection to truth within reality, unconditional love, beauty, the elements water and earth, nurturing. In humans, it usually it manifests itself as attraction to men or masculine people in general. Connection, oneness, letting go, non-resistance, chaos, wildness, animal instinct, the moon, the night, Mother Nature. All right, now for the traits within the masculine principle. So we have planning and strategy, selectiveness, exclusivity, strength, stoicism, guardedness and judgment, details and parts oriented, growth and expansion oriented, linearity, knowledge, communication and expression, perennialness. So in the feminine principle we have cycles. So perennialness means that it's like an evergreen thing. Self-preservation, social structures, movement, doing, rationality and logic, ideas, ideals, clarity, straightforwardness, manipulation of nature for human use, control of the flow of reality, emotional detachment, spirituality, the conscious mind, philosophy, ideologies, admiration, pragmatism, the elements of fire and air, training. Usually in human form it represents itself as an attraction to women or femininity, individuality, tenacity, resistance, order and domestication, higher principles, the sun, the day, and human technological progress. So one thing that you might notice when you look at the masculine and feminine principle is that humanity as a whole group seems to have a lot more liking toward the masculine principle. And so the things within the feminine principle are either, not realized yet. There's a lot of stuff that we're just not aware of yet. Or we'll tend to look at it as though it's like, trite and unimportant at best. Like, oh, well, maybe that would be nice, but it's not really realistic, or I don't see the point in that. So ultimately it's that masculine principle, pragmatism and utilitarianism, and it makes us look at the feminine principle like, oh, I don't know how to even use that. So a lot of the feminine tends to get discarded and tends to be actively repressed too because of our historical past as well. So there's a lot of things sort of getting in the way when it comes to the reintegration of the divine feminine, because we do have kind of a resistance to the feminine principle and we don't really know where to put it. All right, so here are some common ways that society values yang over yin. So we value ideas over reality. We value the intellect over emotions. We value mind over matter, or mind over the body. We view hierarchy over cooperation. We value doing over being. We value growth over contraction. We value admiration over unconditional love. We value movement over stillness. We value ideologies over wisdom. We value planetary dominance over planetary concerns. We value social structures over nature. We value economy over ecology. We value the ideal over the real. And we value individuality over connection and oneness. Now, in the past, it pretty much was universally true that we valued men over women as well. It used to be just a very common thing just to believe that men are superior to women. Now, in our modern society, I would say that the majority of people tend not to really consciously believe that. Nonetheless, because they don't know that there's a masculine principle and a feminine principle, what ends up happening is that they value all of the masculine principle traits and discount all of the feminine principle traits. And that ends up actually creating the problem of gender imbalance. So like any kind of gender inequality does actually stem from this repression. And this is really the core of that issue, but it isn't the only issue. Now, some other problems that this imbalance and disintegration causes is that humanity is basically constantly at war. There's also a lot of inequalities throughout the public sphere because we like to think of things in terms of hierarchies, and we tend to value that more than species-related concerns, as a whole thing. So, what you'll see is giant amounts of income inequality and just thinking, well, that's the natural way of the hierarchy, and really valuing that hierarchy over human lives. Or you'll see problems with corruption in politics, or with planetary destruction, or just an indifference to planetary concerns. Or if somebody is concerned with the planet, they'll basically prioritize economic issues over planetary concerns. That's an example of the imbalance between yang and yin. Also, more on the individual level, we're going to feel more isolation because essentially what yang energy has to do with, it has to do with a lot of individuation, and the shadow side of individuation is that it cuts us off from other people. So we'll feel isolated, we'll feel lonely, and if we don't have that yin element to balance it out, essentially we can end up feeling like we've cut away all of our connection to the world and to other people. And the result of this is a society that's cut off from wisdom, and a society that's lacking in empathy, and a society that's just pretty difficult to live in, where you feel like you go outside and everybody is, against you and only for themselves. And so that's one of the other results of the imbalance between yin and yang and the disintegration of the feminine principle. Now you might ask now, how did things come to be this way and why? Is there an actual purpose behind it, or have we just been making a huge mistake, all of humanity, by repressing the feminine principle? And here's the tricky part. It's not actually been a mistake, it's just part of the system. It's part of the way that the system works. So in the past, the system, basically given the way that humanity was living, in agrarian societies and things, it necessitated the repression of the feminine principle. And so that was where it first started to be repressed, whenever, essentially in humanity's very earliest childhood, we were basically this small little thing in relation to nature. Which is the feminine principle, which is an aspect of the feminine principle, with an expression of yin. And so you see, yin was very powerful and scary because we were so submissive to it, and we're essentially very, I would say, pretty much at the mercy of Mother Nature without all of our technology. And so much of human history has been about creating a wedge between ourselves and Mother Nature. And so essentially, you can imagine that in humanity's earliest childhood, we started off very, very yin because we were just like other animals in nature, and because of the way human intellect is designed, to basically build upon past societies. That's kind of a natural outgrowth of humanity. It's taken our technology a long time for us to truly be okay in the feminine, to be okay with nature. But the way that we've done that is basically we've grown and grown and grown and grown in terms of our technological and ideological advancements. And we've grown further and further and further away from the feminine, driving more and more and more of a wedge between ourselves and the feminine principle. Now this wasn't a problem at first. At first it was necessary because we had to basically go through a polarly patriarchal time where we were only focused on driving that wedge between ourselves and the feminine. And the unfortunate part is that women in those societies suffered because they were the closest human expression to that, that got the same resistance that we had to nature. And so there was just a lot of attempts to control and manipulate nature toward our own ends. And for a long time, this really wasn't an imbalanced thing for us as a human society. Our goal was just to keep ourselves safer and to make our society stronger and better. And that worked for a very, very long time. But the problem with the polarly patriarchal mode on an esoteric level is that once humanity gets as powerful as nature, because we currently are right now very, very powerful as a force, what happens is that human technological innovation starts to sort of step on the toes of nature, and it starts to really, really put a damper on natural cycles. And so that's why the feminine principle is starting to be reintegrated now, and has been for about the past 100 years. Essentially, what happens, because now Alan Watts said something really interesting, so I'll go into this first. So he says that, all right, so if you have a tree that produces apples, and apples is essentially part of the tree, a product of the tree, and just as much the tree is part of the apple. Now with human beings, we basically are part of the earth. We grow off of the earth, and as such, the earth is part of us. And so whenever humanity came in danger to basically our technology becoming a detriment to the planet, the very place that we live, essentially that's when the divine feminine sort of wakes up in us and says, hey, it's time for me to be reintegrated so that we don't destroy ourselves. And essentially that's what we've been doing over the past 100 years, is we've been doing our best to reintegrate the feminine principle, and we have made significant progress. But the problem is that there's still a lot of resistance to the feminine principle. And so a lot more progress has to be made for us to really get out of hot water with how we have been treating nature. So one thing is to release resistance to the past. The past has been polarly yang for a reason. There's a reason why humanity went through that cycle. And, we might look back and feel very uncomfortable, especially if we're women, because then it's like, oh my gosh, why for like all of written history have women been oppressed, and why is it now different, like now that we're doing something different, there are plenty of people that'll argue that we're doing something very unnatural with even giving women basic rights. You can find that all over the internet. And it's because they're thinking, oh, there's a lot of social decay and everything. It must be because of that, sort of kind of like a wrong way of systems thinking kind of idea. But no, it's quite natural, this process, this evolution that we're going through. It's basically that we've reached the pinnacle of what we can achieve in a patriarchal system before it hits a point of diminishing returns and starts hurting us. So esoterically speaking, the masculine principle has a lot to do with growth and transformation, and that's good up until a certain point. And at a certain point, growth becomes cancerous. And that's really at the point that we're at now, is that if we continue to skew in a yang way, it acts as sort of a cancer on the planet. And so there's a huge, it's majorly important for us to start integrating the divine feminine back into our society, because essentially then we can bring human technological development, which is very yang, into integration with nature. And essentially we can start to create things that help nature. And so that's really where I would like to see society go, and I think if we don't end up going that way, it'll be quite disastrous for us as a species and as a planet. Now, one way to help this is to, on the individual level, be able to reintegrate the divine feminine in yourself. Essentially, the more people who have released resistance to the divine feminine, the more it's able to shine through into society and have more of an impact. And essentially, I think I want to give you a metaphor to help you understand sort of how that would work. So if you think about yin and yang, as I said before, they don't really have much expression on their own, but basically that they inform other expressions. So I want you to imagine that yin and yang is the code that makes up your preconditioned personality before any other societal impact or any indoctrination happens. So you just have this natural code. And I would say that it's best maybe to envision this as sort of like little lights, like a million little lights that are either one color or the other color, one for yin and one for yang. So let's say all the yin ones are red and all of the yang ones are blue. And everybody has different lights lit up different colors. So essentially, everybody is completely unique. Nobody has the same yin and yang signature. Nobody has the same exact lights on in the same exact way. But essentially, these lights don't really get expression in and of themselves until a cultural lens is put there. And then once that light shines through the cultural lens, it can actually get expression into reality. And so, for the most part, the majority of women, maybe 80%, 90% even, are going to be mostly having red lights with just some blue lights. And then most men are going to be mostly having blue lights with just some red lights. But there are plenty of exceptions. You can find women with mostly blue lights and you can find men with mostly red lights. But the main thing is that there has to be a combination. And so it becomes really, really important for a person to be very honest with themselves and to realize what's actually there. And that can be difficult because of all of our cultural lenses. So we have to start being able to notice beyond cultural ideas what that unique code is within ourselves and to allow that to shine out. And in doing so, you'll be shining out the divine masculine and divine feminine like unperturbed. But the problem is that our cultural ideas of things tend to block certain traits from being expressed. So imagine that some of those cultural lenses have paint over them. So you have this light inside of you, but then the cultural lens that you have don't allow that light to come out because they're all blacked out. So a person, let's say, who is a man living in a society that punishes men for feminine expressions like vulnerability or like having emotions, maybe all of those lenses might have black paint over them. And so it's very, very important that we remove those cultural lenses and clear off the black paint to kind of, sort of get rid of our limiting beliefs about, what we can and cannot express based on our gender, and what's acceptable and what's not, so that we can create a persona and an ego structure that allows for those things to pass through and to actually get expression out into reality. So it becomes important for us to create a very open identity that's where we don't have very, very specific ideas of how we should be or how we shouldn't be, and just to allow whatever happens to be there. And what will happen is that then those lights won't have distortion or blockages, and more of our natural being will be able to come out into reality. And if we do that with allowing, those things won't be distorted by those cultural lenses, and they'll come out in a way that's actually quite pleasant because it's the divine feminine and the divine masculine. So basically what you want to do is you want to remove all of your ideas about what it means to be a man, culturally and what it means to be a woman culturally, and literally just notice what's there. Now, I'm not saying to contrive a bunch of yin within yourself or a bunch of feminine traits because you think that's going to help the feminine principle. It really won't. You know, just express whatever you have in you and that will help, because everybody has the feminine in themselves. So, you know, if you're a mostly masculine guy with like 90% blue lights, let's say, and you have like 10% red lights, you don't have to change those blue lights over to red. You just have to remove the barriers to the red lights showing themselves. You know, or, you know, if you happen to be a woman with mostly blue lights, that's fine too. That's your natural personality. Do the same thing. Just remove resistances to those particular lights shining out. And so, you know, like I said, it becomes very, very important to remove limiting beliefs when you're doing these kind of explorations. Also, don't use the masculine and feminine principle to create more limiting beliefs, because that will have a backfiring effect. So again, don't use it to try to polarize yourself. You know, there's this idea that, oh, polarization creates attraction. And while that's true, you know, ultimately it's not possible to contrive what's there. You know, like let's say if you plant a daisy, you know, you can't have a gardenia grow from it. You know, but a daisy is beautiful on its own. So it's important to accept whatever you happen to be and to allow whatever happens to be there to come out. Now, there can be a lot of consequences to not accepting what's there for the individual. Basically, what'll happen is you'll kind of end up cutting the floor out from under yourself, and you'll start getting a narrower and narrower expression of yourself. And I had this happen to me before, where I literally just felt like I was in this small space of my mind, and like I just felt so isolated. And that's what's going to happen if you repress your yin energy or your yang energy. Essentially, less of you is going to be coming to the table and more of you is going to be relegated to the shadow, which will exacerbate unconsciousness. You'll have a lot of neuroses. And essentially, because the shadow wants to integrate, but the ego doesn't want it to integrate, you're going to have this struggle between those two aspects of yourself coming together. And so it's going to create a lot of strain on your system, and you're going to be quite stressed out. So it's important that whatever identity you create, whatever persona you decide on, make sure that it's as transparent as possible, you know. And so in order to do that, you have to sort of get rid of cultural and societal ideas and just notice whatever is there. Now, ultimately, when it comes to the disintegration of the divine feminine on humanity as a whole group, I think that this is a very, very dire sort of topic that we need to address. Because I feel like if we do not make the jump between where we are now and being a society that has the divine feminine fully integrated, you know, that's going to cause a lot of damage to where we could end up at a crisis point, some point in the next few generations, where we essentially are stuck in this big mess and we have to either backpedal from it somehow and try to reintegrate the divine feminine from that place, or, you know, we just might not make it as a species and we might actually end up throwing the cycles of nature off permanently because humanity has become so powerful. So ultimately, when we see the symptoms of the disintegration of the divine feminine in the form of extreme inequality, of constant warfare, of corporate greed, of, you know, gender inequality, of all of these types of things, we should look around and we should take that as a wake-up call that it's time for us to allow space for the divine feminine to come back into humanity and to actually make the changes that we need to make to get there, and to remove the barriers to the divine feminine coming back into the collective consciousness. Alright, so here are a few final pieces of advice that I have to give you relative to helping and assisting with the integration of the divine feminine in yourself as an individual and in society as a whole. Alright, so the first thing that I recommend is to be very aware of how the divine feminine, through the mode of the yin code, tends to sort of express itself, and likewise the way the masculine principle tends to be as an expression of the divine masculine. So have an awareness of what's in the feminine principle, because societal ideas don't really give a clear picture of what the feminine actually is and how it expresses itself. There's also the problem that a lot of people who are actually pointed in the direction toward progress tend to see the feminine and the masculine as only being a result of social constructs as opposed to actual subtle energies. And so, and this largely comes from the fact that social construct does have so much to do with the way those two energies express themselves, you know, those lenses that I was talking about. And so there tends to be like just a not noticing that there is a divine feminine and a divine masculine that represents that presents itself in a particular way. So just knowing what's in the divine feminine sort of mode of expression and what's in the divine masculine mode of expression can be really important for detecting imbalances. Also, I recommend that you personally assess yourself and to kind of throw off any kind of limiting beliefs put there by your family or by society relative to what is appropriate for you to express in terms of gendered traits. You know, there tends to be certain ideas of what's acceptable for women and what's acceptable for men, and these can really get in the way of seeing what's actually there, what masculinity and femininity you actually have. And so sometimes the biggest barrier to authenticity would happen to be just cultural attitudes toward a particular yin expression or a particular yang expression. And what I've noticed in my life, again, is that women, when they're very young, they have a tendency to either buck traditional femininity altogether and say, oh my gosh, that's oppressive, that's terrible, and they really resonate more with the masculine principle, and they're usually the type to kind of think of it as neutral and to think that really it's just a social construct. So they tend to fall over on that side of the horse, and then the other half tend to really identify themselves with the feminine, to really value femininity, but they end up in a place where they can never really realize the full breadth and depth of it because they're really only experiencing the tip of the iceberg. So that's really the barrier for women that I've seen that's most common. Now for men, again, the most common barrier that I've seen is that any expression of the feminine in men can be punishable in some societies and in certain social groups. So if a man expresses any kind of feminine traits, he might be seen as lowering his status, or he might even be, picked on, like called a lot of like feminine insults, or even beat up. So this becomes a huge problem, and it really creates a sort of fear of the feminine in a lot of guys, and it takes a bit of bravery to be able to even own your feminine traits. And so it's important to be able to sort of make some time by yourself to introspect and to see what's actually there, and to try to actually embody the traits that you really have. Now the next bit of advice is more on the social level, and is to really advocate for the values in the feminine principle. So a lot of times people will just have a negative attitude toward aspects of the feminine principle, and it's not because they have any conscious anti-feminine bias. They just don't like it for some reason. So if you're in a conversation with someone and they start using like being emotional or being emotionally sensitive as being like an insult towards someone, or a criticism of something, or something being too fluffy or airy-fairy or something like that, I think it's important to sort of remind them that the emotions actually have a function. They tell you important things about what you want and what you need. They are also conveyors of deeper forms of wisdom as well. So, essentially, if you learn how to read your emotions, which very few people know how to do properly because we don't really teach that as a skill like we do with reading and math, people would be able to act from a bit more of a place of wisdom. So imagine that we had the same type of antagonism toward our thoughts, and we just didn't want to have thoughts at all. We wouldn't be able to learn how to read or write or do math because essentially we'd be in resistance to that part of ourselves. So if we're in resistance to our emotions, we're also not learning important skills. So basically, because the emotions are an aspect of the feminine principle, people will tend to have this like antagonistic type of viewpoint toward it that you can notice, And so I think it's important to like especially check people on that point. Or if you see somebody who is really anti some other aspect of the feminine principle, like they see that nature as not being as important as economic interests or something like that, you might remind them that, the entire economy wouldn't exist if nature wasn't there for it to exist from. This is like, you don't want to cut the very branch that you're sitting on out from under yourself. And so I think it's very important to, again, advocate for the value of the feminine principle in just small ways here and there to get people to question their notions and resistances to the feminine principle. Also, I would recommend taking a lot of time for stillness and getting in touch with your intuition. Basically, any kind of like feminine principle skill that you can learn, and like any type of thing like that that's going to help you get more in touch with what's going on in your internal experience will help you get a lot more insight about what's going on out here. And so, basically, if you want to personally reintegrate the divine feminine, stillness is a perfect way to start doing that, because essentially the divine feminine is already trying to have influence. It's kind of quiet in a sense. And so you have to allow yourself to be still for that to actually be able to come up. That's what kind of creates a space for it to actually flow into your awareness. So it's very important to practice things like that. Also, I think that it is a common cultural conception that because we relate masculinity to strength, then we see femininity as weakness. But I think it's important to see it as just a different kind of strength. So if we think of the masculine elements of air and fire, the fire particularly has an immediate effect on something, and you can see its transformation automatically. Whereas the effects that the earth and water have on something are quite subtle. You might not notice that an effect is being had, but over the years, these are the erosion and the water running over things, really do have an impact on things. And so I think it's important to look at the masculine principle and the feminine principle and see that they're both very strong. It's just one is a more subtle form of strength. And so I think it's important to understand the strength in that kind of subtlety, because even though it's subtle, it doesn't mean it's not powerful. And of course, it's important for an individual to have both forms of power on their side, because it's important to be able to be an integrated person. And ultimately, that integration is going to allow you to have more of, let your life force energy really be able to come into fruition. Alright, so that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead and click the like button below, share the video. I really think this is a very important video, so if you're ever going to share one of my videos, share this one. I just thank you again to everybody watching, and thank you especially to my patrons. You guys are really, really awesome. And until next time, keep becoming more you.